Hello, and welcome to JordanCONline. This panel is the writers from the writers track called To FTL or Not to FTL. Is a discussion on how different tropes in science fiction can affect the story you're trying to tell. We have some amazing panelists, and let's let them introduce themselves. Diana.
Hi everyone, my name is Diana Faux. I'm a book editor, also 3-time Hugo finalist for Best Editor. Woo!
Woo!
I work at Tor/Tor.com Publishing, but I also have over a decade of experience in the publishing industry doing various roles. So I think that's pretty much everything.
All right, thank you, Diana. Amy.
I am Amy Dubov. I publish under AK Dubov. I write primarily space opera stuff, and I have a large sci-fi universe called the Catacomb universe, where I have multiple authors working with me now, and we have various space opera and space fantasy-like stories that we are in the process of developing, and I also have some other standalone works in the general genre.
Good. Thank you, Amy. Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Hughes. I write the Mind Space Investigation series. That's the ones that are published thus far. And basically it's telepaths, CSI in the future. It's lots of fun. I'm a shameless science nerd, which I'm sure is why I got invited to this particular panel. And I'm really good at bullshitting, which will help. Oops, I said the word. Oh no. The word got said. It's so sad.
Yes.
I will indefinitely.
Let's try and keep it PG-13. We don't know what kids might be handy.
So you used up our only swear, or are we allowed one F-bomb as well?
One F-bomb as well.
Okay.
Nicole.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Kurtz, and I run Mocha Memoirs Press, which is a small publishing company that specializes in amplifying marginalized voices in speculative fiction. I'm also the author of the Sybil Lewis series, which is a cyberpunk / pulpy detective in the future series. Think of it like Shaft in the future. But I'm also like the director of the science fiction track for Multiverse, and I'm also like a huge Star Trek nerd, so I think that's why I'm on this panel.
Hey, you all have multiple bona fides. Including you responded to my email.
Yay!
Yay! Participation for trophies. So let's just go ahead and dive into the meat of it. So FTL, faster than light travel. Who wants to start about what kind of things, including it or purposely excluding it, can do? How do you feel that changes the story?
I think.
Now that is called the Great Pause, as they say nowadays.
The Great Pause.
Alex.
It's probably worth making a distinction between several different kinds of FTL and why FTL matters for those who don't know. FTL is faster than light travel. I assume anyone in JordanCon knows, but the big deal about that is that Einstein and some other scientist types, what do they know, believe that it creates time dilation as you get close to the speed of light. And so that time dilation creates all sorts of interesting story effects. Personally, I find it kind of tedious to have one twin getting older and one twin not getting older. And anyway, it's totally an Asimovian thing. But if you, wave your hands and say we have hyperspace, you get to, completely ignore all that and get on with the meat of your story. But you can also do interesting things with wormholes by connecting parts of your universe with other parts of your universe, Madeleine L'Engle style.
Right.
Yay, Tesseract, fold the space. And so it's a matter of what I like with wormholes, if I ever write a space opera, which I probably will, honestly, is by collapsing space, you can also do interesting things with geography. Yeah. And one things that I feel like we don't do a good enough job with in science fiction is in letting geography affect story. I mean, we all have desert planets and shit. Not that anything is all desert. But oops, I'm using all the swears. It's totally me today. Sorry, guys. If you've read the books, you know why. I just curse. It's a thing. But, you know, even if we do hyperspace where everything is equally accessible from everything else, that lets you slow down journey speed without like making it infinitely long so that you and your twin can like never be the same age again, which, you know, I guess is a real world problem, but I've never experienced it personally.
I knew
Yes,
that. Go ahead, Diana.
So building on that, you can, depending on the kind of scope that you want to have in your story, you can build the FTL system around that. So that could be anything from pretty much instantaneous travel, or it could just be a reduced travel time. So you can figure out what that ratio is that you need to span. Like if you have a galaxy-wide civilization that you're dealing with, it's going to be very different than it's just a few systems apart.
Right.
And you're dealing with one general arm of the galaxy, and that's going to change the constraints that you need. So if you really want your characters to be able to show up places quickly, you can set up a system where you have either wormholes or just space folding or something where it's like you pop in one area and you pop out somewhere else.
Yep.
But otherwise you can be like, well, it's going to still take a few months to get there, but it would have been hundreds of years otherwise.
Right.
And that you can build in story elements of what that journey looks like, not just going from point A to point B.
Yeah, it kind of gives us the rise of the Skywalker thing, where
Right.
they visited all the planets in
all
a
the
couple
planets
hours.
really quickly. Boom, boom, boom.
And it's, what Amy pointed out that was really interesting that I thought about was how a lot of stories about, you know, journeying essentially is basically about how people change in terms of like where they see themselves in time. And if we don't have faster than light travel, then the course of journeying across space it's less than about contacting like various places, point A to point B. You're just establishing your various planets on a giant map. It's all about like establishing worlds and locations and interaction between locations. So it's more of a tool as opposed to methodology of telling a story about a journey. And I was just thinking about, you know, if we don't have it, then, you know, it changes the meaning of travel, because it not only changes the focus of the story, but their characters' understanding of themselves in relationship to the entire universe. Faster than light travel, you know, is very much like how the internet changed our world to make it just feel so much more smaller. But without it, then, you know, characters can debate with themselves like, oh, well, I guess this ship is now my world for a set period of time. What does that mean? What does that mean when a destination is more of a theoretical possibility than actuality? And then the story in itself becomes less, you know, about, you know, we just want an excuse to have a huge variety of different civilizations that are dramatically different from Earth, to becoming more focused, like, no, this is actually about the group of people themselves as they're traveling.
I definitely think that not having faster than light travel is a tool for horror science fiction, and like because of the necessity to build suspense. If you look at examples of that, such as Event Horizon, or I just watched the Europa Report, and all these. There was a great Chinese science fiction story last year. Is it The Walking Earth? Moving Earth? The Walking Earth? The Wandering Earth.
The Wandering Earth, yeah.
So they're very much about what Diana said and what Amy hinted at as well, is very much about the people involved, not necessarily the journey. Whereas Star Trek was about the journey, right? And its effect on humanity, not the humanity on the ship per se, in every instance. So I love how science fiction horror tends to, if you look at Aliens or Prometheus even, it's about the journey, the people on that ship, not necessarily about their journey per se.
Right. And it's interesting that you also brought up Event Horizon, because I was thinking exactly when Alex mentioning space folding, like, oh, I hope they don't fold into hell.
Right?
It's just spice.
It's just the spice.
No, but you know, and it's funny how a lot of science fiction ideas that are, rooted in like theoretical science, comes very, very close to like, no, it's just fantastical.
Right.
At a certain point.
It's just
Well, and then there's like Jeffrey Carver's Dragons in the Stars, where literally you go through hyperspace and meet dragons in hyperspace. So like the line between sort of fantastical and fully fantastical is like really blurry.
Actually, if you're familiar with Catherine Asaro, the way she does the faster than light travel is actually Einsteinian, and her thing is like she did the math because she's a mathematician, formally trained, and she's like, all you have to do is just turn yourself imaginary for a little bit, and then you can cross the threshold.
And then you rotate through imaginary space, and it's lovely.
Yeah, exactly. You translate to imaginary space, and then the effect of going faster than light in Einsteinian terms, which means time goes backwards. They actually did go backwards in time whenever her characters traveled, and it was more expensive, like in fuel costs, to be slower. It actually got cheaper and cheaper the faster they went, but then they also went further back in time.
Oh, wow.
So that was an interesting take on it.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to artificial intelligence.
AI.
So it's important to make the distinction between weak AI and strong AI. And weak AI is stuff that we can do now. It's what takes an audio file and turns it into a transcription from a computer. Like it's automating routine tasks. And that can be very powerful and change the whole landscape of society in very specific ways that we're facing right now. But I have the feeling that since you were talking about true AI, what you're talking about is like the science fiction, self-aware, singularity, like holy shit. Is it Heinlein, Luke the Harsh Mistress? Hi guys, I'm sorry. I curse. I do this in person too. I'm sorry, guys. But yes, if there's ever an opportunity for like a thinking machine, like to do things that we cannot do, that would be strong AI. And I'm gonna stop cursing now. Obviously, that's gonna happen. Yeah.
We'll have to train an AI to bleep you. So how do you feel that, even if it's not the core of the story, how does having AI, especially thinking AI, change things?
I definitely think that, for example, in my Sybil Lewis series, one of the stories, she interacts with a cyborg, but it's near future. So this type of combination of a human being with these parts is not true IA, but it's uncomfortable for her and it's uncomfortable for society because it's just kind of not ready. And I feel like it depends on if we're like ready to approach like the uncanny valley. It's like looking at the dolls that are made for adult people. I'm trying to keep it PG-13, but they're not self-aware or anything like that, but it is like very unsettling to a certain degree, to have something that isn't alive in the sense that we identify now, and the idea of them being alive. And I think that was Data's whole purpose in Star Trek: The Next Generation, and that's to include it would be a study in humanity, right? And what does it mean to be human? Right. And so not having it, of course, is fine. You can use other people for that. But I think you can use, when people use AI in stories, it's to investigate or research or explore what does it mean to be human under X circumstances or X settings.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's also very closely tied to looking at where humanity can go. Because, of course, as technology continues to improve, you have this idea of a completely synthetic organism versus being able to augment what it is in your organic form and doing gene editing. And so where's that balance there? I think something that is definitely worth exploring in science fiction is looking at what society would look like as you begin building up both of those things, and that battle between the organic versus the artificial, and redefining what life is and sentience, and giving, do you have this, what essentially looks like a computer program to us, do you give it rights the way that you would have as a person? And that's a very, very complex thing. And we will have to deal with that in our lifetime, but especially looking towards sci-fi, that's very far future, or a different race that is coming in and has maybe already gone through these things.
Right.
I think any starfaring civilization probably is going to have gotten to the point where they would have been able to have this fully sentient artificial life. And have they decided that it's a really bad idea to get rid of all of it? Have they integrated somehow? Are they at war with each other? Lots of stories.
Agreed.
Yeah. And when I think about AI, and I think we see it a lot now, and how, people are developing, technologies that kind of use like bits of AI or just in general machine learning, and how flawed that is because the programmers themselves are flawed. And so seeing all these, stories about like, oh, how technology like still contains the same biases that people have, because like the programmers are mostly like of a certain like demographic. They had, overlooked like these elements when, designing the code, and then it carries on to like how the machines react. Or I think about how in the court system, there is now like recommendations that are AI generated, based on, case studies in law. So, and like in the history of like, of a record of like previous cases for this, like, in this part of like the country, which obviously is super biased because it totally ignores the history of policing, but how people would assume automatically that because this was made by a machine, it's totally unbiased, it's totally objective, it's unquestionable, because there's supposed to be some sort of ideological purity that comes with machine learning, machine bias, even though there's so many examples of it not happening. So I think the question of AI and how it develops in science fiction stories, it's interesting how the crux of the conflict, or the theme of, a lot of AI stories, is that, oh, is the robot really human, or is it not, as opposed to like, the robot is already human because we made him. And so what are we going to do now when it turns out they are a terrible human?
Right. Yeah.
That reminds me of, I don't know if it's something that was a fake news thing, or if it actually did happen. It's all blends together nowadays. But I remember reading somewhere about like a chat bot that had been made.
That was a real thing.
And like 4chan got their hands on it and turned it into a racist 14-year-old.
Yeah, that happened.
And one of the reasons why it happened is because they didn't put the feedback in place. There was no human involved in the learning part. And so they basically left it alone. And our understanding of how humans learn and how we think machines should interact with the world versus how they actually do depends on the data we train it on. And also, like, I don't know, I find where this intersects with the idea of augmented humans, as Amy was talking about, to be particularly interesting, because it turns out that humans are good at things that machines are not, and machines are good at things that humans are not. And while it's interesting that data wants to be more human and have an emotion chip, I mean, I also would like to unplug my emotions at will. Like, I find it more interesting to think about, like, the US military at one point was working on a system to try to present more information to a decision maker in the front lines. And it turns out that they had a guy perform better, basically just with a fancy like phone system, talking to people actually on the front lines, than the one with the machine that overwhelmed him with the sheer amount of data, because people can't process that amount of data. But even if you did have the machine pick the 5 most relevant things that you need to know in warfare at that moment, who's picking what the 5 most relevant ones are?
Right.
Exactly. Like, a system that really does augment you in a useful way and lets the humans do the sorting and the empathy and the emotional decisions and like the experiential decisions and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
ideally would let the humans do what they do well, but behind the scenes, then you have all these problems with how do you train the machine in the way that Diana was talking about. And it's going to be really important as we're building the future together for us to make some of these ethical decisions together. But like, it's the augmentation, even if we made a strong AI, like I want to know how they would be different from us, because machines are different from us.
They are. No, I agree. And I definitely think that the nuances and biases that it's like Google's drive, auto cars that drive themselves, they don't recognize African Americans, right? So they just they don't see us because they weren't trained for our skin tone. And so they miss us. And so they would hit us if they were like released into like production. No one thought about that at all, because you don't have people of color in their designing room when we're talking about these things.
Right.
That's more of a societal issue in terms of like and hiring and who's in the room. You see that again in terms of like writing for science fiction shows, right? Who's in the room, who's in the writing room for shows that will help alleviate some of these awkward things that come up, and you're like, wait, if you'd had someone Black in the room or 3 people Black in the room, you probably wouldn't have done that Pepsi commercial, right? But it's who's in the room when we're designing these modern day AI, when we're looking forward to the future. That needs to be a diverse cast.
So go ahead and go off my script already.
Sorry.
No, I'm going off the script. You guys are
Okay.
great. That you guys have been touching on augmented humans, wetware hacking, and splicing your own genes. How do you feel that kind of getting beyond our fledgling near future? Like how do you think that's going? How does that start affecting the story? Is it different than AI? Creating this other of human?
I mean, I think it's all about intentionality in some aspects. For AI to be developed, as a being separate, to function on its own is different than like changing oneself or changing other human beings. I'm actually really curious about, the definition of an augmented human being, because, even, like 40 years ago, if you test tube babies, that was a big controversy. Like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
There was a Space Marine show that actually had a whole lot of racism against test tube babies that was in it. I can't remember the name of the show off the top of my head, but I remember they'd grown soldiers, and they all had like little things on their neck. There's like, oh, you are a test tube baby, and there's all that racism about it.
So
sorry to derail you.
Yeah, no, but like the point is, it's like people don't really think about that anymore at all. It's just completely integrated. Like, oh, it's just the person was just born this way. That's all. And I wonder if like with augmented human technology, as people adapt it, and of course like there's the whole element of what's allowed legally and what's accepted socially as well. But the more people do it, and if it becomes more socially acceptable or legally allowable, will it just be understood like, no, they're just a person, they have this thing, but they're just human. And I think the closest current analog in this conversation perhaps might be, how trans and non-binary people are treated. If and they're just people, and whether what they do to like confirm their their identity is their choice. But even that is like so controversial when it should be essentially like a private personal decision. And I think the more different technologies develop that can change the human body or influence one's DNA, or the more these questions will come up about not just debating like the humanity of the people who choose to do it, but also having it conflict with like some sort of like moral value system or religious value system.
Yeah.
Who wants to follow that?
Yeah, I know, right? I think probably the first thing, the more near future would be kind of the Gattaca type future of just picking and choosing different traits. But I think in looking further ahead, you're probably going to start having people who want to bring in like different animal DNA and that kind of thing as they figure out how to merge those. Like, I really want a tail, or I'd really like to have scales, and it just the ability to really so now you can get tattoos or piercings or various surgeries to change your appearance, but being able to actually edit that at the gene level to give yourself things. I think it'd be super cool to be able to regrow limbs just lizard tail style.
It turns out that some people, not all children, and some adults, like 10% or less, can regrow a finger up to the first knuckle when turned off.
Wow.
What?
Not everybody.
How can you tell?
Well, you cut off your finger and then you
hope for the best.
Do they not identify genes for this?
But how cool would it be if you could gene edit such that like people could do that automatically? That would be amazing. I want to add bioluminescence to my skin. That would be really amazing. I'm just saying. But yeah, and we're already talking about gene therapy for cancer, and we're already talking about like, it would be really cool if you could mess with your genes in your eyes to like, I don't know, I think you could do all sorts of really cool things. But on the other hand, like, we seem really uncomfortable when people enhance themselves with steroids in like sports and stuff. Are we going to be really truly comfortable with super soldiers if that's a possibility? And how do we treat them when they come home? Like, what does that mean in society? There are definitely bigger societal implications beyond just what people are doing at the individual level.
Absolutely.
I think you have to look at the context of the world as you're developing characters that would be fitting into a story that have these kind of augmentations, and looking at the differences that you'd have in the world as a whole.
And, and on top of, world building, it also brings into like this this other element of like, you can have augmented, people and like have cool elements, but if it comes down to gene editing, then now you have questions of like, how close is this to eugenics? How close of this is to, eliminating or denying the humanity of disabled people? If you can just erase it, quote unquote, and all of the, ethical, questions about that. The biggest debate in recent years was when there was a Chinese researcher who claimed he changed the DNA for a couple of newborn babies to make them resistant to AIDS.
I remember that.
And how that news just like shattered the scientific community because of the ethical, consequences of doing that. Like, he didn't tell anyone that he was doing it. He just did it. First of all, so like this rogue scientist isn't exactly being framed as a hero, as opposed to someone who, didn't care about, the ramifications of what he did, as opposed to just wanting to prove a point. And saying like he had a cure for AIDS. I'm like, well, and those are the questions we have to think about too. It's like, if there was the ability to prevent cancer from ever happening in a human being, would you do it if that could also, possibly mean like changing someone's genetic code that, that would have like, lasting consequences and change things about their personability that wouldn't have been a problem anyways?
Shauna McGuire or Mira Grant's Newsflesh, where the cure for cancer and the cure for the common cold merged and made zombies.
Yeah.
No one gets the cold and no one has cancer anymore, but the second you die, it activates in you and become a zombie.
And that's what I was going to say. Like, these are all great things to have. Like, I want to have bioluminescent skin. I do. I want to have wings, right? But I don't know what the alternative would be, and I'm not sure we as a society are ready for that consequence either. And so I love how in Ghost in the Shell, especially Standalone Complex, everyone has some sort of augmentation or full cybernetic bodies except for Togusa, and they mock him for it. right? Like, when are you going to get, new eyes to Augusta, right? Because he's suddenly vulnerable because he doesn't have like an impenetrable body. And so I wonder, I mean, that's one of the things we think about, right? Is if it becomes so normal, what about those people who are not interested in those in any augmentation at all, or gene splicing or assistance? What happens to them in society, right? So I definitely think that I agree with Amy, when you're world building, you have to kind of flesh out and make known what those religious implications could be, or what those societal implications will be for those augmentations or genetic splicing.
Well, and just to go off of what Nicole said, it's really important to think it all the way through as far as societal implications. At least in the first few generations, these kinds of augmentations are likely to be expensive. So they're going to radically transform how the rich people and how the poor people interact with the world, and that's going to cause other implications.
Which was the case in Altered Carbon and Richard K. Morgan's story, right? There's that delineation between those people who can afford to consistently re-sleeve, right, versus those who could not.
Okay. Let's move on to the concept of clean and cheap energy. We all like having dilithium crystals.
But those aren't actually cheap. They require mining.
I'm like, didn't like Cronus explode because they over mined it? Yeah, so cheap, clean energy. We like to have it, but at what human or what cost, right? What cost?
Yeah, and so I guess that the two aspects we can talk about there is one, when it's not as clean and cheap as it's advertised, when you have to go mine the unobtainium from underneath the great tree to get it, versus no, we actually, hey, we're now a type 1 society, world, or type 2 civilization, and can harvest an entire sun without and energy is just so abundant, it's post-scarcity, kind of. So how do you? Yep.
Yeah, so I think that really comes down to the kind of story and world that you want to have, and the tone of it. So you can really change your energy source to fit the kind of constraints they want. So if you want that darker, kind of less optimistic view, then you have very constrained resources that maybe don't work as well as they want. But if you're wanting to focus on other aspects in a more aspirational future, then you can have that, well, yeah, we just came up with this 0 point energy thing, and the level of science that you put into that can be changed based on the needs of it. So you can have the more science fantasy side, or you can have just straight up space fantasy, or you can have it very hard SF, just depending on where you're setting and what you want to do.
Alex?
I was just going to say, from a historical perspective, I was a history major. You have to understand that fossil fuels are kind of the cheap, clean energy historically. I mean, we have built our entire civilization off of relatively cheap energy. And yes, we have global warming as a result, but it took a long time to have global warming, and it hasn't killed us yet. In the grand scheme, I mean, this is really cheap energy that has built huge civilizations and cities, and done fertilizer to create more crops, to keep more humans alive than have ever been historically. So we are living in that age right now. And my question is, what happens when it goes away,
right.
And so as we're thinking about building, cheap, relatively clean energy, I always want to know why it's not really clean, but that's me.
That's also me. Is it really
but what does that look like? And does it have a shelf life? Is it a thing that is going to work for a while and not work for a while? What can we learn and understand from history, and how it impacts how we build civilizations?
So I was thinking, when you said cheap, clean energy, I was like, if it's really clean energy, I was thinking it must be a utopia. And then what I always feel like utopias have like a very greedy underbelly. It could be because I'm like obsessed with greediness and dark pulpy things. But I think that if you're going to have, I agree with Amy, if you're going to build that kind of society that you want to not focus, you want things to work, but you don't want to focus on clean, cheap energy, then yeah, you could come up with something that's fantastic, that works with no repercussions, right? It doesn't cost a lot of money and it benefits all. But even with what Alex said in terms of like our fossil fuels now, there's a cost, like coal miners and lung issues, and look at like oil spills in our oceans. Like there is a cost. So cheap, yes, meaning that we were able to do great things and survive and grow and be a productive civilizations, but it does come with a heavy cost that's not exactly cheap in terms of lives and quality of lives for all citizens, right? Needs of the many, I guess.
I also think about how the illusion of cheapness when it's controlled by larger institutions.
Right.
For example, like oil is relatively cheap as long as all the oil producing countries set the price correctly. And there's other. I think about how there's so many like green energy options in development, which are theoretically cheaper, but no one wants to invest the cost because there's already established energy, institutions that have a lock on keeping their control. So that of course they don't want to have, your solar power or your wind power, if as long as you can control your oil and your gas. So I do think, the concept of cheap is very subjective, depending on what kind of society you're building.
Yeah, I don't think you can have any kind of discussion about power sources or distributing resources without getting into the equivalent of the corporate angle of it,
right.
and the forces that are behind that. It might not actually be corporations in the current sense, but the people with power who control the resources are going to be a major player in whatever discussion is going on. Yeah,
agreed.
Okay, well, let's see. Last thing I had on mine, and if you guys want to talk about a particular trope, feel free to pipe up. Kind of already touched on that. So, nanotechnology was also one of the things I'd kind of talked about.
I completely abuse nanotechnology in my stories, especially when I have a PI who gets shot a lot. So she uses nanotechnology to repair wounds and stuff. They're in pain patches, so she just puts on the patch and it delivers right to the source. It starts to heal tissue and stuff. I totally abuse it. It's probably nothing like what nanotechnology actually does. But I definitely think that I've seen it do all kinds of things in movies, and I'm like, I really need to spend more time with it, honestly. But I think it's a great tool for storytelling.
Nicole has
definitely
a good point that nanotechnology and medical technology are like natural twins. They're not the same thing, but they should be a lot of the time. And how the implications of that, if you can literally take a small robot in and excise the cancer from the inside and come out, that would be amazing. But I also think of privacy considerations. We already have cameras so small that anyone could be filming you at any time. And how much more so would that be if the camera could in theory be unseeable,
right?
Or kill switches in people for that matter.
Yep, I've seen it.
You can get really dark really fast.
Yeah.
But also really good really fast.
Really fast, right?
Yeah, it's extremely powerful technology, and I think that as you're looking at nano, that is a very important consideration when looking at the level of technology that you have in your world. Just thinking, for example, any spacefaring race, probably you have to deal with any of the radiation that's out there. A person can just not go out into space on there, but as soon as you add in some kind of medical nano that can just be repairing you as you go, then it's great. Sorry.
Yeah.
It bring those things together and look at the way that everything is working as a whole in your universe.
Absolutely.
Well,
sorry about the interruption there.
You're fine.
What would terrify me about nanotechnology, particularly if we're not talking an implant, we're talking free-floating nanotechnology in a medical sense, is like, do you know how unsecure the Internet of Things is right now?
Yes.
Yep.
It is. Like
Like
wide open.
Anyone can wander into any smart thing in your house and like change your temperature or like look at your baby monitor, get the secure one, or don't get video. But like can you imagine living in a world that unsecure where like people could literally kill you for like, I mean, that would not be sustainable. So the question is like, how do we deal with that on any technology? How do we think about security? How do we think about like, there's a whole group of things that you have to think through as a society. And
it quickly becomes some fridge horror. You know, kind of like those people who sometimes extrapolate Harry Potter a little far.
Yes, but it does. I mean, it's a little frightening. But the idea that safety is an illusion anyway. But the idea that something that you can't see is but it's so powerful. That's a problem.
What I think about nanotechnology, for some reason, I had like this weird association in my head, like, oh, nanotechnology, it's like glitter, and glitter is like the herpes of craft.
It is.
You know? Object, you know, it's like, I'm like, it'll just get everywhere, and then you can't fully get rid of it.
Yep.
And then if it gets into the ocean, it'll kill all the fish. Like, but from that chain of thought, I immediately thought about, containment, and how can you fully, not only for security, but just for the sake of like, keeping things like unpolluted and clean. I mean, I think we've now accepted that in our environment, there's a certain level of plastic in everything, including ourselves. Will nanotechnology become like that too? Like there's just a certain number of nanos in you at any given moment.
And who knows how many of them are active? I mean, do people just start walking around with personalized EMPs? They need to clean.
Or you just accept that your body will eventually deactivate them. And, they have only a 2-week life cycle anyway. So if it's really important, you stay home for 2 weeks so you don't get infected with a new one. And then you go to your
quarantine.
And it's fine. It's not a big deal. And then otherwise you just live your life unless you're like a spy or something, in which case, you're really in trouble.
Right. So when Sybil uses the pain patches, they fade. Like they have like a certain amount of time to work, and then they no longer work. So, but I definitely think that there should be some parameters around them, around nanotechnology. But it's like all things. When webcams started, my mom was like, "Oh, please don't use those. Those are horrible. They're unsecure." But over time, technology built in fail safes and security around those things. I think the same will happen with nanotechnology as well.
Yeah, and from a world building perspective, and as you're looking at your story and you're building it out, that can be something that is just all happening in the background. Like we know that we have nano and it's not there, or it could be a main central feature of your story, and you can decide how you want it to appear in there and what fits with the overall tone and scope of the story that you're telling.
Absolutely.
And it's always good to link those things back to a why do you care moment. Nothing should appear on stage unless there's a reason why the character cares.
Right.
So that's through my list of rough tropes. Any tropes you want to talk about? Anything? Yes, Alex. the precocious young lady in the front.
Hi, it's me. You clearly met me in high school. Okay, so I want to know, there's one thing that I've noticed that you almost never see in science fiction. And to be fair, I was involved in a Twitter discussion. This is not my idea. But like in Star Trek, they have these, you know, teleportation things where like it's the, I used to know, they do the glitter thing, you beam me up.
The transporters.
Yeah.
Transporter. They have transporters, and yet you have scenes with women giving birth. Now I ask you, why? If you could just transport the baby out, no one has to have any pain, it doesn't have to be a thing. Like, even if it's important that you like gestate for some reason, like why the fuck? Or,
There it is.
There
There's
it
the one.
goes. There's the F-bomb.
That's your one.
You know, I've actually thought about this. I've thought about this too. I think to answer it, if you have the resources, you probably would transport it out, unless there's some, like, I could see that there would maybe be issues with bleeding out or something. If you're like just taking something, there'd be a hard cut there. And like, how do you define like with pulling out the baby? Like, how much do you take?
Mhm.
And so I could see it just having a controlled natural birth being less risky than transporting out. But I think rather than a C-section, you probably would see some kind of transportation technology.
One of the big things about the transporter, and it's kind of like a running gag amongst Trekkies, is that it's unreliable. Like there's two Rikers, right? And there's been instances where things have happened in the transporter with using the transporter. And I think using it on a pregnant woman in labor might be too big of a risk, in the sense that horrible things have happened with the transporter. So I definitely think, I know you're thinking like, I know Alex is like, well, horrible things happen in childbirth, and you're not wrong. But I think medically they're advanced enough to alleviate birthing issues versus transporter issues.
It's introducing more risk rather than preventing risk.
Exactly.
And I'm just like, if we're going to imagine a future, why are we imagining a future with women in horrific pain again? Like, it's all about who we have in the room.
Yeah, right. I also think too, initially with the transporter, I don't think we spent a lot of in Star Trek as a world building thing.
Yeah.
The transporter is a staple, but it hasn't actually evolved, right? So you see how like phasers have evolved, and now we have a holographic doctor, right? And we have more advanced ships, but the actual technology for the transporter itself has not changed. And so I don't know if that is, again, a conversation with, it's just such a staple like this shuttlecraft, you don't need to, or if it's just we're not thinking about that because we're a bunch of men in the room, right? Or what have you. Those are all good questions, but I would suspect initially they thought, well, it's too risky, and they just
Bones
left it there.
hate it.
He did not like it at all. And again, like I said, there are two Rikers. And the whole thing with Nemesis is that they were able to get some of Picard's DNA to make Tom Hardy another Picard. It was a transporter situation that happened. So, yeah.
So I'm assuming, in that case that technically transporter technology did evolve, but, in relevance to like the changes involved were so like, technology or a type of like the methodology is still the same, but the sophistication is so much better. So we don't screw up as much, basically.
I would hope.
Yeah, we would all hope.
I mean, if you watch like Picard, his transportation back to the Federation's campus in San Francisco was like super fast, right? It was very fluid, and it looked like it had evolved to a certain degree. But I still don't know. I still have no understanding for why they don't use it on pregnant women. That's a great question.
I just think who is picturing like what advanced medical technology looks like and how we live. And I mean, Elizabeth Moon has people being treated if you had enough money so that you lived to 200. And that's kind of an interesting set of circumstances too. I think advanced medical technology is its own thing in or out of nanotechnology that's worth talking about.
I can talk a little bit more about that if you guys want. Any other advanced tech? I know we touched on regrowth some. How cool that would be to be able to just regrow limbs.
I think life extending tech for sure is something that would be there. Just being able to prevent aging at the same rate that it happens now.
Oh yes, and being able to live, and what that means. I mean, that's the basis for altered carbon, right? The resleeving is you never really die; you just get a new body, or another body.
So I think even just preserving the one that you have, would be a big thing. I mean, altered carbon is kind of it's a really neat concept, but it's a very different thing than just extending your own. Right.
It's just your consciousness that's being extended, not your actual body itself, right? So I just watched another movie and I can't think of the name of it, where the people were living like 200 and 300 years old.
Elysium gets into it a little bit. That was an older one.
Yeah, but it was recent and it was British.
There is. I can't think of the show that you're talking about, but Michael Blumlin, one of his last pieces he wrote was a novella called Longer, and it kind of addresses this extended life technology, and it's about a couple and how you have the ability to regenerate at least 3 times, and live longer that way. And the husband decides not to use his third life, and the wife doesn't understand why, And so I think that is a really fascinating question, because for her, like, she feels like there's always something new going on. She's always like learning things, and she's constantly like into her work, and he is too. Like, it's not a question of like him like going through some sort of depression or existential crisis. He's just like, no, like, I had 2 great lives with you, and that's okay. That's all I needed. And that was just something so beyond her comprehension. But it's also just a fascinating, just mindset to have. Like, how do you really know that when you have enough? And I guess that question only really comes when you have the ability to choose how much you have.
There's one other topic, I guess I got skipped past, but we can talk about. Shields and lasers, energy weapons. Versus physical ordnance and heavy armor. The Battlestar Galactica versus the Star Wars and Star Trek. I feel that changes things.
I personally think that any futuristic space battle is probably going to have both of those things, because like, just a railgun can do so much damage, and it's so low tech compared to any other kind of energy weapon that you may as well just hurl a thing at another thing and make it go away. So, but by that same token, energy weapons have their own uses too. So I think coming up with some combination thereof is the way to go.
Yeah.
I met this guy in college who was working at Georgia Tech in one of their labs on ceramic shielding, where they literally had this like bodysuit that they put people in that had these little ceramic tiles in them. And the idea was that the tile would they designed it so a tile, like a scale, would break, and that this would diffuse a lot of the energy with the breakingness of it all. And I wonder if there's a way to do something similar like that with energy, where you're doing individual cells that like to break or do something interesting. Because the problem with energy is that how we intuit in like Star Trek or whatever is that your shield's at 15%. Like, that's not actually how electricity works.
That's not how any of that works.
And like lightsabers, like to build that, like it's not going to stop here. Just like
it's just going to keep going.
It's just going to go forever. And you're going to lose an arm, and the guy next to you is going to lose an arm until it all shuts down. It's going to be awful. But I like the idea of energy weapons as they're built in science fiction. It's just I have no idea how to interact with that, because it seems to have nothing at all to do with how I understand physics to work.
Right. It's just purely, this is the science fantasy element.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh.
Absolutely. I mean, you definitely can't go offensive battles with Klingons and Romulans without shields. Like, how do you protect yourself? You'd lose your whole fleet every time you wanted to engage in something heated. So definitely science fantasy.
Yeah, well, and I always really did appreciate, but both with The Expanse and with Battlestar Galactica, that
Yes.
it's all physical ordnance and just hardened ships.
Yep.
And yes, they hurl things at planets to destroy them. And and they have a rail, and they've got the rail gun that they can use to really mess you up.
Yep. I think that's more grounded science fiction than what we have in Roddenberry's Future or in Lucas's Star Wars, right? It's more grounded. It's actually more realistic or touchable than what we're used to seeing. And I think some people really love The Expanse for that reason, and some people are like, I cannot, because it's too realistic, right? It's too grounded. They need something a lot more light, and I use that term loosely.
Well, and flashy. There's
Flashy.
is something fun about like the dogfight in space idea.
Yeah.
Like, it looks fun on the screen. It's completely unrealistic in how you would actually have a space battle. But it
Space
looks really
bombers,
cool.
they happen. They're real.
They always happen to me.
And I think people look to sci-fi for escapism in a lot of ways. I mean, there's certainly the science fiction that makes you think and be really introspective about the direction of the human race and those things. But there is also the sci-fi that exists for entertainment and entertainment first and foremost. And so if you just want that really fun feel, should always observe. You create your rules for your universe and be internally consistent, and that's the most important.
That's pretty
thing.
much it. I agree with that. I do agree with that.
It doesn't necessarily need to be Einsteinian physics that are those rules. I mean, just come up with it, but just know how your universe operates and do it. So like I have subspace and force fields and energy weapons and all that stuff, but I have very, very specific rules, and I've had to build out those rules as I've brought in more people to be writing in my universe.
Right.
So now we have, I think the style guide's up to about 14,000 words now. That just explains how all of the tech works and how all the abilities work. And it's like the more that you think about it, as people ask me questions, I document that stuff. So now everyone is on it, and I read every book to make sure that all of it is consistent. And I think of things every time I go through a new thing. So just always be on the lookout for how you want to define the universe that you're creating, and think about the ripple effects that those decisions have on other things.
Right. I agree with that completely. I'm actually working on a Bible now for a universe that's more fantasy oriented than it is sci-fi, but yes. It started out for a short story, right? It's a 5,000 word short story. And then the more I outlined the story, the more I had those questions, Amy, and the more I was like, I should write this down. And I actually spent like 6 or 7 hours working on the Bible for that universe for a 5,000 word story. So just be consistent with your
rather than short fiction most of the time. Because I want to put in that amount of effort to everything that I write, but like I'm just.
It's going to end up being longer than that, but yeah. But yeah, just be consistent in your universe with their rules, and you'll be good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out to this panel. Coming out, staying in,
zooming in.
Zooming in.
I love it.
This has been JordanCONline to FTL or not to FTL. Thank you all for watching, and stay safe, stay healthy, and see you on the other side of this.
Bye.
Bye, guys.